Hi, Will Brooks, Sales Director at Spectrami in the UK, and with my colleague Grant.
Hi there, Grant Tiller. I look after the technical side at Spectrami UK.
So, um, recently I wrote an article on LinkedIn which was basically asking the question, what is DevOps and how is DevOps going to change the world that we live and work in? It got really a lot of feedback and quite a lot of interest, so I thought it was worth us just pulling together a short 3 or 4 minute video just to try and delve a little bit deeper and explain what DevOps is. So, Grant, do you just want to pick up there?
Yeah, so one thing worth mentioning before we go any further is that there is a very interesting book called DevOps for Dummies. I wouldn't say it is for dummies. It's now on version 3. It doubles in thickness every time they do a new release, but it's interesting reading, and I think it really puts into context exactly what DevOps is. But from our side, let's give you a quick overview. Let's talk about DevOps, and let's go from there.
Okay, so the question, what is DevOps? And I think there's a lot of people maybe have got a different opinion about what it is, and is it actually a thing? Is it just a different way of working? Explain that.
So DevOps is a combination of two words, which is obviously development and operations. And what we're seeing typically in organizations now is that the same person needs to have a skill set in both camps. So if I look at finance as a classic example, on the trade floor, we used to have people who were really good on the phones. They were looking at investments. It was a case of who could get to the phone quickest and who could put the money in the right place. The way that sort of market and that area is changing is the traders are now becoming really software developers. And these software developers are working on mechanisms that can do the trades quicker. Obviously, it's all electronic, so you're taking out the analog element of trading. Now, in order to get these releases done, in order to get these new trading systems live, they need to have really good IT skills. So, the traders are now IT people in their own rights, and they need to have knowledge and skills around IT, and not just bringing up systems, but it's also putting the trading systems on that, getting it up and running. And if they want to change, make things higher performing, then they need to have good skill sets around developing the software, releasing the software, getting it live.
So that's interesting what you're saying there. But one thing that DevOps isn't it's not just a new way of software development. Software development went from waterfall to agile, and there's some people going, "Oh, the next phase is DevOps," and that's not the case because DevOps isn't software development. You would still have an element of agile and that whole process in a DevOps environment.
Absolutely right. So development using waterfall, basically the technique was it's done when it's done, and we'll keep working on the same release until all of the features and functions we need to build are complete. We're not sure how long it's going to take. We're not sure how many people we're going to use to do it, but eventually we'll get there and we'll have a release ready. When we move into agile, we break up the same development process into manageable chunks. So you could have a sprint within an agile development frame, which could be 2 weeks long. You assign a certain number of people to that sprint. You decide what you're going to do. And on a regular basis, you have a scrum meeting with all of those contributors. You ask how they're getting on. If there's any problems, they're flagged out, they're addressed immediately. And you've got much more control over the release process. Now, actually, if you look at DevOps, they could be using a combination of waterfall and agile development. So it's not the third development type. It's really a completely different mindset, different skill set, because you need to know about racking and stacking the compute resource, as well as building the software yourself.
Yeah. Okay, and I guess the whole DevOps piece is almost come around always a lot more possible because of something called microservices, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And I think we probably just need to touch on microservices now, just so that we can understand what that is, and you can sort of maybe talk through this while I draw out sort of a traditional environment where we'd have some on-premise servers, and on these servers, obviously with the network, you would probably be using some level of cloud out here. So let's just assume that we've moved into Azure. But on these physical bits of hardware, and you could also, the same principle would apply in the cloud, but you would have your hypervisor, you'd have the operating system, and then maybe we'd have app 1, app 2 on this box, and this same thing would be replicated across here, and you'd have different apps and
correct, and
different amounts of
the
computing
developers
resource.
are concentrating primarily on the application stack. So we're assuming that the hypervisor, if they're using one, the operating system layer, that's a given. It's going to be across any server platform they build on, whether it's on-premise or whether it's up in the cloud. The developers are concentrating on the app stack, and traditionally that application would reside on one piece of compute resource, no matter where it is. So you've got your different parts of the application. So the example that Will's doing here, perhaps a triangle could be authorization, so registering the application on the network, applying the necessary security tags, writing data perhaps to a database, maybe somewhere else on the network, transactions, logging, all of these shapes that Will's drawing up now represent a different part of the application, a different feature or a different function that the application is performing.
Okay, and then we've got sort of an element of cloud computing here, but obviously the other thing that's happening in the market space today and in industry is that we're going to this much more disparate hybrid cloud where you've got different providers. So let's look at this as traditional, and we assume that that's where people are. A lot of people are still here, right? And there's nothing wrong with this approach. It still works very well for people. But where people are moving to is more this DevOps environment, and hybrid cloud is more involved. So we might have Azure over here, but we might have AWS. There's obviously lots of other providers there.
And perhaps there's still an element there of private cloud, so you're still going to have a compute stack that's sat on premise.
Yeah. But look, we got more. Let's assume we've got more compute up in the cloud, so we'll have less physical servers in our data center.
Absolutely. So the idea behind microservices is you take each one of the functions within the application and you distribute it across the network and across the compute resource. So each one of these shapes in this example could be across the different compute resources.
Okay, so what we could say is this microservice here could actually be running in Azure.
You got it.
Yeah, okay, and then this piece could be in AWS, and that could be running on one of our physical servers on site, and then you've got this there.
So the final stage, you output to a log somewhere. I might keep that on site because it's very low cost. It's traditional spindles. It hasn't got the performance requirements or failover requirements. But then on the flip side here, perhaps we're using a database that could be replicated across different AWS data centers across the world.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing is then with microservices, and I think things like Kubernetes and things like that, where you drop this down and you don't need that anymore, and that disappears.
Yep.
And the next time it spins up, it's up here, because that's now the best place for that to run, and you've got kind of complete flexibility around that.
And what you're starting to encroach on here is containerization. So when we move into microservices and we look at the concept of containerization, it could be that each one of these processes, each one of these product features is only actually resident for seconds in the extreme example. Yeah. So here, traditionally, if you look at a server, the server's built, it's stood up, and it's going to be resident on the network perhaps for a period of years. If we move into microservices and look at containerization, then perhaps we bring up a container, we log the user on, and then that container is wiped out because it's no longer required. So it's only alive for, in the extreme case, a number of seconds.
Okay. Now, one thing that I got asked the other day, and I'll ask you the question, obviously I know the answer is does it have to be this approach or this approach?
It can be either approaches, and both approaches are absolutely valid. There's a strong use case to keep the traditional architecture, and then move across to microservices and containerization where it's appropriate to do so.
Okay. So I think one thing that we're both agreed on is this isn't a case of if this is going to happen. It's definitely a case of when, and we're seeing some really successful people moving down this route now. Organisations delivering thousands of lines of code every single day because they can work in this way.
Classic example with Netflix. They're doing hourly updates of their software platform because Netflix is delivered as a cloud-only platform. It means that they haven't got to go through the release cycles and updates and slow rollouts. All of the customers, all of the users get those updates immediately.
Brilliant. Okay, so anything you want to add on this, or I think we've about finished, haven't we?
I think that's a great start, perhaps a great introduction to microservices and what is containerization. I think the exciting thing from a Spectrami point of view is these are technologies that we're working with, and we're hand selecting vendors that really add a lot of value to this process. Moving across allows an organisation to be more agile. Perhaps it would allow an organisation to be more profitable, and maybe in the future it makes them more attractive for prospective employees. I would want to work for an organisation that's more cutting edge and more innovative, and I think this is really exciting in terms of the space that we're working in at the moment.
Well, look, hopefully this has been informative. Please follow us on Twitter, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and thank you for watching.
Thanks a lot.